I'm Karen Sinsheimer, the Curator of Photography here at the Santa Barbara Museum of Art, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you here tonight to hear the estimable William Ewing. Before I start, I want to thank my support group, Photo Futures, for supporting this lecture, and I also want to thank the Spanish Garden Inn, where William is ensconced in quite lovely surroundings, and he thinks he might take a midnight swim. He doesn't quite do that in London. I don't know why. Well, it's my great pleasure to introduce to you William Ewing, and we're very fortunate to have him on this side of the pond. William Ewing, I'll never forget meeting him for the first time, and I was, of course, I was scared to death, frankly, because he was the eminent director of the Musée in Lausanne, and I thought, oh my goodness. So this collector said, well, call him up. You two need to talk. So I thought, oh, sure. So I called him up, and he said, well, sure, we can have breakfast. How about 3 guys on Madison Avenue? I thought, 3 guys. Okay, I'm going to like this guy. Well, sure enough, here's William Ewing. He is an author, curator, and as I said, former museum director, and he's lived and worked for 40 years in both North America and Europe. He is the founder of Optica Center for Contemporary Art in Montreal. He founded that in 1972. He moved to New York in 1977, and he is director of exhibitions at the International Center of Photography. In 1991, he moved to London to work as a freelance curator and author, and then in 1996, he was named director of the Musée in Lausanne, Switzerland. This is one of Europe's premier photography museums, and he remained there until 2010. For some reason, they have a mandatory retirement age. Thank goodness it isn't here. Anyway, he is currently curator of special projects for the Foundation for the Exhibition of Photography, both in Minneapolis and Lausanne, and he is director of curatorial projects for the publisher Thames and Hudson. He serves or has served on many boards, juries, advisory committees in both Europe and America. Now, his list of exhibitions is beyond impressive. They've been shown in such institutions as the Museum of Modern Art and the International Center for Photography in New York, the Serpentine, Whitechapel, and Hayward Galleries in London, the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, the Centre Pompidou in Paris, the Musée National Reina Sofia in Madrid, the Art Gallery of Ontario in Toronto, the National Gallery of Canada in Ottawa, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, and many others. One wonders when he ever sleeps. But he also has written many books, and he's a very, very fine writer. His books include The Body, Face, The New Photographic Portrait, Inside Information, Imagining the Interior of the Human Body, and many monographs on such artists as Ray K. Metzger, who just died recently, Leonard Freed, Erwin Blumenfeld, Edward Steichen, Ernest Haas, and now Arnold Newman. He's here again because he has co-organized an exhibition of the work of Arnold Newman, and that will be shown in San Francisco at the Jewish Museum of Contemporary Art?
Yes.
Contemporary Art. And he's also co-authored books on Lynn Cohen, Paul Atterbridge, Allison Jackson, and others. Throughout his career, he's lectured extensively around the world, and between 1998 and 2009, he taught the history of photography at the University of Geneva. And I thought I was busy. In 2009, Mr. Ewing was co-curator of the New York Photo Festival, and in 2010, he curated 3 shows for the Festival Les Contes Parole in France. In 2010, he was decorated by France as an officer of the Order of Arts and Letters. So it is truly my honor and privilege to welcome William Ewing, who will deliver a Curator's Choice lecture on his newest book called Landmark, The Fields of Landscape Photography. And this is a new book, and he will be signing copies of his new book in our museum store after the lecture. So William, thank you so much for coming.
Karen, thank you for that wonderful introduction, which impressed me. I know all the things that aren't quite true, but I'm not going to tell anybody here. If I can get away with it, I'll get away with it. I really loved the invitation. Karen said, you have carte blanche to talk about curating. And my first thought was the thought that most little boys have when they're on vacation and their parents says, now write a postcard to Auntie so-and-so. And you look at that postcard and you can't think of anything to put on it. Oh, I don't know what to say. Well, just say that you're having fun. Oh. So that was my first reaction. Oh my God, what have I got to say? And I thought, well, I've been doing this for actually 43 years now. So there's something wrong if I don't have something to say, at least to fill an hour. And my first thought then was, okay, let me think out loud about what curating means, because it's a word that is bandied around a lot, and in a fairly sloppy way. And then I thought, that'll be a bit dull for anybody but other curators, and probably other curators too, who would think they know everything I would be saying. So I thought, well, wouldn't it be more interesting and more even fun for me to look at my latest publication, latest project, Landmark, the fields of, I wanted to call it the fields of photography, but the publisher said, no, you have to work in the word landscape, because if people Google landscape photography, your book won't come up if it just says Landmark. And it's not what I wanted to say, I'm confessing to you here, it's not what I wanted to say, because what I meant by the fields of photography was the literal sense of fields, deserts and agricultural places and mountains and so on, fields in that sense, but also the fields of landscape photography in the sense of photojournalism and advertising photography and publicity, the kind of thing we have on cereal boxes. That's what I meant by the fields, but as the book ended up anyway being pretty much what we call art photography, I thought, well, I'll live with the fields of landscape photography. And to talk about these two subjects, curating and landmark, in conjunction with each other, I'm going to have to go back a little in time and talk a bit about how I got to this point in the first place. And perhaps look at some of the landmarks in my own life, because I think they will enrich your understanding of this project. First, a word on curating. The way it's being used is it increasingly bugs me. It's like the word culture. You know, culture used to be a word reserved for anthropologists, and it meant a total life system of a tribe somewhere, or of a series of a group of tribes sharing the same values and beliefs and so on. And then it became adopted in business, and you ended up people talking and say, well, the culture on the third floor is very different from the culture on the second floor. And then the culture at that end of the floor is very different from the culture at this side of the floor. It just became a silly buzzword, and the word curating is becoming this now. You'll see in the New York Times, it says, curate your own Christmas gifts. And to give you an idea, you are California people, so you know about celebrity, so you probably won't be as amused at this story as I am, but I was in the archive of a big magazine recently, and they were talking about, I can't identify it, but a big magazine, they were talking about doing a big portrait show, and they wanted my advice. And the curator had put together portraits from the collection of the magazine going back 30, 40 years. They were fantastic. And he said, yeah, and we can get a celebrity curator like Brad Pitt. And I said, wait a minute, you mean you've worked on this for what, 5 years? Okay, you worked on it for 5 years. You're going to have Brad Pitt come in for 20 minutes, if you're lucky, and go, I like that, I like that, I like that, I like that, I like that. And then he becomes a curator. And of course we know what that means, that there would be 500 journalists at the opening, and it would work. But thankfully, he decided to not go ahead with that route. So I'm going to make some confessions during this talk today. I'm not really a curator in any kind of trained sense of the word. I fell into photography literally, quite literally, in 1972 when I worked for business, actually. I was in a big telecommunications company working as an anthropologist. Because those were the fashionable days of communications theory. So companies suddenly started hiring anthropologists. And, but in my spare time, I visited a theater that a friend of mine had opened up. And the building itself had a big empty white cube. And I said to him, wow, you should do something with this space. And he said, why don't you? You should. From one night to the next, I dreamed up this idea of a gallery, and the next morning when it was decent, I called him, I said, were you serious about that yesterday? If you give me that space for 6 months, rent-free, I'll put in a gallery. He said, what would you show? I said, photography, because there was no photography gallery in Montreal at that time. In fact, there were very few anywhere in the world. There were 2 in New York, and there was 1 in Detroit, and 1 in Paris, and 1 in London, and so on. So I'll do a photography gallery. And he said, what do you know about photography? I said, well, nothing, but that's never stopped me before. Got through school like that. And so I opened up a photography gallery, and what I did to educate myself was I simply invited famous photographers to come and speak and show. And if you know how it is in life, if you know about people and their reputations, it's intimidating. But if you've never heard of the person before, so let's say you're sitting in a plane and you say to the gentleman next to, what do you do? He said, well, I'm the president of the International Geographers Institute or Association. You go, oh, that's nice. But if you're a young geographer, you quake. Oh my God, I'm sitting beside. So I was a little like that with these photographers. I invited Lee Friedlander and Andre Cortez and Arnold Newman and Cornel Kappa and Robert Doisneau and Dwayne Michaels and Ralph Gibson. I would just ask photographer friends of mine who I should invite, and they say, oh, you should invite Lee Friedlander, but he'll never come. And I just call up Lee and I'd say, oh, we'd like to come over there. Oh, sure. I have $125 for you, I said. And they all said, oh, that's great. Money was never what drew people to photography, and I think that's still true today. And I educated myself because I entertained them for either a weekend or a week, and in some cases even a month, because I asked them to give workshops. And in that time that you spend over coffee and drinks and with meals, you hear really how the field is, how the field works. And I started to bring in shows from other places, and I had a real field day for 5 years until I was invited to come to New York and work at the International Center for Photography by Cornel Kappa, the founder. And he's another person I had invited up, and so that's how life works, isn't it? One thing leads to another, to another, to another. But what I found exciting as I moved forward in the photography world was that I loved the past as much as the present. And I felt the past is never given enough time. I feel even today that most of us are rushing down in the photography field. Photographers, curators, and so on. Most of us are rushing down the valley, gobbling up everything. Everything that's new, gobbling it up and moving forward in a mass. And a few of us, I think Karen is with me, we're sort of hovering at the back and saying, hold on a minute, guys, you missed something here. But they don't hear us. They rush forward. And sometimes as we go down through the valley, we look to the left and the right and we see, ooh, smaller valleys that are quite fertile and worth exploring. And we go up into those valleys and we find things. But we're in a minority, and I think that's because of human impulses. The majority of all of us have to be looking forward. That's why the eyes are in the front of the head. And if we were all looking backwards and moping about the past and so on, then it would be a sorry state for the world. It's a sorry state anyway, but maybe it wouldn't be the best way of moving forward. In any case, I found that what I loved best about photography was its language, trying to understand its language, its funny language. Every time you try to put it into words, words fail. They don't quite, how do you describe a photograph like this exactly? Its syntax, the kind of grammatical rules, if you want. Its magic, its mystery, the fact that we are totally seduced by pictures, evident from the billions of pictures that we produce every day, literally billions of pictures. We can never seem to get enough. What is it? What is it that drives us forward all the time and almost bulimic about photographs? I love all that. I love kitschy stuff. I love billboards. I love bad, corny advertising. I like photography on cereal boxes. Wherever I look, I find it sort of reveals something about the human condition. That's what I love about it. So curating for me is really an attempt to kind of make sense of all this. And the way I tend to make sense, personally, is look for common threads. Sometimes common threads that aren't so obvious. So, for example, one of my first... Oh, going the wrong way. Just what I didn't want to do. Exactly what I didn't want to do. All right. So, the first... major attempt to look backwards was actually about dance and photography. I decided that there was something fascinating about the fact that dance photography could be so interesting, and yet it was in black and white, and it had no music, and it had no motion. So why did it attract us so much? And after I'd done a big project on dance photography, I started thinking about what other themes I could look at that hadn't been looked at before. And I realized that flowers dated right back to the very, very beginning of photography and right up to the present. And almost every photographer I knew had done flowers. This happens to be Imogen Cunningham. But wherever I looked, I then found fascinating pictures of flowers. These 4 pictures are actually the same picture. It's the same picture, printed 4 different ways by Edward Steichen in the 1940s. So he was just purely playing around with color in an experimental way, which makes him look like a young, hip photographer today, and showing the astonishing range of what's possible in photography. Or Robert Mapplethorpe on the left, who's quite famous for flowers, but always said he hated them, actually. And André Cortez on the right. An anonymous photographer on the left, who did something quite wonderful, trying to show you the shape of the leaf and the flowers. He actually has built up the earth behind so that the white shows clearly, and then has the darker green against white. It's quite a beautiful aesthetic solution to a purely technical problem. That's a botanical photographer. And this is probably the first photograph ever made, because this dates to 5 years before photography was invented. The date we like to give is 1839. In 1834, Fox Talbot made this picture. And he cut the reason for the shape of the vase is just because he cut out a piece of paper, snipped out a piece of paper and photosensitized it. Didn't want to waste paper. It sort of has this sensuous shape of almost like hips, right? That's just kind of saving paper. And the reason it's a flower is merely because he needed an object that he could basically destroy in the process. And of course, what's more common than going out into the garden and grabbing a flower rather than using a piece of lace that your wife will not be happy about. And then this project was a thrill for me, and I ended up doing a big show on both sides of the Atlantic. I did 2 shows simultaneously and circulated them to 4 or 5 museums on each continent. And I like that. I like the marriage between exhibitions and books. And often today people will say, Bill, what do you do? And I say, well, I do books and shows. I do books and shows. I like the fact that books are very intimate and you turn the page. And it's a personal thing. Sometimes you do it with someone looking over your shoulder, it's true, but it's a very personal thing. And an exhibition is a much more public way of looking at photographs. But an exhibition has original works. So see this Fox Talbot in the original form, or the Mapplethorpe, beautiful platinum print and so on. You can't get that in a book. A book is printer's ink. It's printer's ink, and you'll never get away from that. It's not silver salts. So if you have a book and a show together, I think it's the ideal marriage. And I'm very happy to say that among younger people who are media savvy, younger photographers coming out of the art schools today, they all want books. They all understand that a book is a book. The iPad and the e-book and so on, they know that that has no substance and probably won't even be readable, decodable in 5 years' time. Something about the permanence of that book is something is sacred about the nature of a book. So after I did this, I was hungry for another big project, and I thought, what hasn't been looked at in great depth? Lots of books on the nude. Lots of books on the nude. Photography is full of books on the nude, almost always young female nudes, until the 1980s when we started to get some male nudes. But I sold the publisher on the book by saying, listen, if you think of medicine, medical photography, if you think of sports photography, if you think of dance photography, if you think of advertising and so on, the field's incredibly rich. Let's do a book on the body. And he agreed. And these are just a couple of spreads to give you a sense. That's a Man Ray on the left of a woman's torso wrapped in a cellophane. Very, very modern material for 1920. Lee Friedlander on the right, which pays homage to Edward Weston's famous vegetables. Leo Levenstein, New York street photographer on the left, and Helen Levitt on the right. So is that body, what I saw it would never be classified as a nude, never classified as a picture of the body, but simply by defining it as a body photograph, I appropriated it. And what I loved about it was the dance-like movements. Unintentional, unconscious dance-like movements. And then the next stage was I thought, the face. After the body, the face. And the face, I wanted to call this book The Death of the Portrait. And the publisher says, oh, no, you can't put the word death in a title. Nobody buys books with the word death in them. Call it new. So I held up a new photographic portrait, and it sold some copies. And I looked at all the kind of photographers that were destroying conventional portraiture, trying to think of new ways, like Aziz and Coucher here, who kind of show these people as imprisoned in skin, imprisoned in masks made of their own skin. Or George Bush being made up for television, and a bizarre picture of a Taliban from Iraq, highly retouched and feminized. A very interesting cultural product found in an abandoned Taliban hideout by an American photographer, actually. And I thought it was sort of fun to put them together. And that's another thing I love to do. For me, I realized, just thinking about the speech today, I thought, what I love best is the double-page spread. I spend inordinate amounts of time putting pictures together because I think whatever you do, you form a third message, a third feeling. And it's also interesting if you put them, if you reverse the order. you wouldn't think it would make a big difference, but if actually put the Taliban on that side and George Bush on this, it would actually change the reading, because the human mind somehow takes that double and composes, a gestalt about it. And I love playing with that. You've seen, if I just go back you see the way I'm playing with the double page? Sometimes I change the scale of the photograph, because in that case, the Man Ray would have overpowered the Friedlander. There, it's a classic balance between the two. So that double page spread is very important. Or Valérie Bellin, who photographs real women, but in such a way she has them wear white. They're wearing white robes over their shoulders, so it turns them into sculpture. No retouching. Oops. Okay. Go back. So this brought me to the latest book, Landmark, and I thought to myself, this goes back 10 years to me. The idea really came to me 10 years ago. And at first, I started putting things away. I feel that landscape is somehow very photogenic. The two subjects that are photogenic, always look great, is landscape and architecture. It just looks great at the time. That's all those Architectural Digest magazines, they're so seductive, right? Just turn this page, oh, we can't get enough of it. Huh? Every month, can't get enough. Where's the new one? Where's the new one? Can't get enough. Architecture and landscape. I don't think that's true of the human body. I think people look once and go, oh, that's enough. But landscape is something special, and I decided to make it a project, but it took 10 years because I kept putting it aside and procrastinating and worrying about it, and then forgetting about it, and then picking it up again, and then finding an intern who loved the subject to say, okay, you work on it for 6 months, and then the intern comes and goes. And so it took me that many years, and then a couple of years ago, a British foundation said, listen, we'd like you to do a show for us, anything you like. And I said, landscape. And I jumped at the chance, and normally in museum practice, you do a book and a show at the same time. And sometimes you do the book slightly after the show because you run out of money or time, but you conceive of the two things together. It's not what happened here. I did the show first, and there never was a book for the show, and I said, great. I wanted to use the off-Broadway model, where you do the thing off-Broadway, you tweak it, you test it out with the public, and you say, ooh, the ending is a little too sad. Better like add a jolly song at the end, and you tweak it a bit, and then you launch it on Broadway, and you make your trillions or you lose them. And so with Landmark, I said, great, I'll do the show. I did the show at Somerset House, which is a very old palace, but a very new place for photography. And I was so excited at the opening because it was March the 14th, 2013. And I could say at the opening, the English love little speeches before shows. At the opening, I could say, exactly 161 years ago, in that gallery there, Sir John Herschel, uttered the word photography in public for the first time. It just happened to be the same night as the opening, March the 14th. And the Somerset House used to house the Royal Society. And Sir John Herschel was the royal astronomer. And he suggested the word photography would be better than sun pictures or sun drawings. And they have his notes, and they're handwritten. And he says, I'm going to propose the word photography for this new species of drawing or painting. So that was exciting. And the photographers were there at the time. So there were 80 of them in the show, and 20 or 30. They were, just the association with this place where the word photography was born was kind of electric. But when I say I wanted to do this for 10 years, a lot of things were coming into focus. One of them was the wonderful poem by Robert Frost called Fire and Ice. I'm going to read it, I'm sure you all had it probably in school, and maybe it'll come back to you when I read it, but for me it was very inspirational. Some say the world will end in fire, some say in ice. From what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. But if the world should perish twice, I think I know enough of hate to say that for destruction ice is also great and would suffice. So I thought, boy, that's perfect for landscape photography. Hot and cold, fire and ice. But I mean it in a metaphorical sense. Fire being degraded, despoiled, irradiated, ruined, desolated environments, and cold being the jungle at Disneyland, where all the trees are cloned. The world's largest indoor rainforest in Berlin. Probably will be the only one in a few years. Or the snow dome in Saudi Arabia, where you can ski when it's 45 degrees outside. That's what I meant by cold. I meant sort of planned, superficial, artificial, unreal, and surreal. So that was a very inspirational poem for me and remained in my mind. I was even thinking of calling it Fire and Ice, but I called it Landmark. And then I found a wonderful thing from an 1891 photography annual writing about landscape photography in 1891. 1891, and this is what I read. That one may see for miles and miles into a bit of paper, no bigger than one's hand, is of necessity a perpetual wonder. And I thought, isn't that true of photography? You see miles and miles into it. And I love the sense, the fabulous sense of that, because we've become so jaded about photography. We've become so jaded that we forget that for only 160 years ago, it was seen as miraculous. The first photographs of landscapes were miraculous for people. Nobody had ever seen, 99.9% of the human population had never seen the Arabian desert, for example, until daguerreotypes arrived. And yet, in our own time, I could read in the Times, listen to this now, 1/2 of Britons admit they have never stopped to admire the British countryside. And 68% say they wouldn't know where to stop to enjoy it anyway. I love this idea. I love this. They hadn't stopped, as if this, our state of being now is in motion. That's the default position. And God, I can't stop. Where would I stop? Where would I stop? It's very sad at the same time. And yet yesterday, I got on the plane in Heathrow. We cruised over cloudless Britain, the Lake District, then over the North Sea. Luckily, I had a great window seat. Over Ireland, looking like the gem that it is. Then over the tip of Iceland. Then over Greenland, over Labrador, and down across the plains, across the Grand Canyon, into Los Angeles. And I was the only person looking out the window. Everyone else was staring at the little dazzling screen. And the stewardess kept saying to me, put your window shade down. Put your window shade down. I said, yeah, I paid for this. So, I think there's something, we are dazzled by our technological reality. We are mostly amazed by ourselves, Alex de Botton said recently. We're mostly amazed by ourselves. So travel is a big thing for me. Travel and looking and seeing, and unlike photography, when we travel we can move into a landscape. We can go behind the hill, we can go into the valley, we can climb the mountain. But most of us don't do that anymore. Most of us just stop by the side of the road, if we know where to stop. And landscape does go back in photography right to the very, very beginning. Even before photography was invented, Daguerre had a famous theater called the Diorama in Paris. And I'm going to read you this quote. He had a new form of optical entertainment, something like today's IMAX, but all done with painting and the clever manipulation of light. He unveiled this to a curious Parisian public who found themselves face to face with a living alpine landscape and caught up in the spell cast by the mountains, chalets, and streams of the Swiss valley, so like a natural scene that one critic of the time described himself as never having been so vividly impressed by any other representation of nature. It was an illusionistic space. It was a theater like this, and the actual platform rotated, so you would see through a series of blinds and lights being natural light being added or subtracted. It would seem to snow and go from day to light and so on in the painting. It was only a painting. Photography hadn't been invented yet. But it was the inventor of photography, the French inventor of photography, Daguerre, who had come up with this idea, and it was a natural step. So I like the fact that landscape photography dates back even to before photography was actually a possibility. So those were some of the motivations of doing a book on landscape photography, but I also had to convince a publisher. And publishers like to be convinced by topical arguments. And one of the arguments I made was, well, everybody's, the environment is on everybody's conscience today. And you cannot open the newspaper without reading about raising sea levels, desertification, new diseases, some very spectacular new diseases, expanding ozone holes, pollution in 1,000 forms, oil spills, each spectacular one kind of erasing the memory of the last. Have you noticed that? Disappearance of the bees, disappearance of frogs, and always the articles ending with, unless something is done very soon about this. Unless something is done very soon. I mean, oh yeah, okay, well, something will be done. We'll get to doing something about that. And just pulled out of the newspaper this one of last week, Choking the Oceans with Plastic in the New York Times. Listen to this. In a 2010 study I conducted of the Los Angeles and San Gabriel rivers, we extrapolated that some 2.3 billion pieces of plastic had flowed from Southern California's urban centers into its coastal waters in just 3 days of sampling. So that means in 3 years, 1 trillion. So if you picked one out every second, it would take 32,000 years to clean up those pieces of plastic. We're all in this together. But it certainly was a good argument for looking at a book about landscape photography, because obviously a lot of the photographers deal with these issues. So I began to think about where you see landscape photographs. One thing is, advertising. Most advertising is pretty awful. Postcards, going to come back to that one in a second. I love these corny postcards. You've got everything there. You've got mountains, lakes, greenery, waterfall, flowers, everything. This kind of corneas, which I think is a company that makes defense stuff. And of course, the absence of landscape. What I love about advertising for airlines is everybody is asleep. It's like, go to Tokyo asleep. Don't have any sensory total sensory deprivation. Don't see anything. Don't feel anything. Oh, that's a great way to do it. Yeah. I think that tells us something about something we're losing, really, a kind of curiosity. The advertising in the 1950s used to show happy American families looking out the window of the Pan Am jet at the Taj Mahal and going, no, now sleep, just sleep, don't see anything. Get on board, go to sleep. But I did think most of the advertising. Right, I'm going to come back to this one. I thought this was quite a brilliant ad for Caran d'Ache. which you might know is pencils, colored pencils, very high quality colored pencils. So they've taken Zermatt, right? Great Swiss mountain, essentially. White pencil covered with snow, avalanche streaked, and they've done a little cloud. And it's a delightful metaphor for the imagination. You know, buy our product and dream. And you know, when I called up the company and I said, I'd like this for my book, they said, fine, no problem. And I said, who are the photographers? Who is the photographer? They said, what do you mean? I said, well, there's a photographer who took the picture. Oh, you don't need to know that. It's just our advertising. I said, no, I do need to know that. I do need to know that. I mean, but it was like you're getting, what's that expression? Squeezing blood from a stone. Yeah, it really was. They didn't want to give this up. But I insisted, and I was really proud at the end that I had the name of the photographer in the book. And then I might need a little light for just showing you the kinds of things you find it on. Could I have a little bit of light, Jim? Right. You find it landscape on beer coasters. Here's a poster I bought at the station. And I love Swiss postcards. I never get enough of them. And all sorts of products use advertising. I don't know if you can see this picture that well. It's an ad for a company called Louis Vuitton. And it shows a very poor girl in a canoe. Her name is Angelina Jolie, I understand. And she has nothing. She's shoeless. All she has in her life, she has no oar to propel the boat forward. All she has is a leather bag that everybody else has to carry the only thing she has in the world. And the ad says that she's on a journey. But where, we don't know. But landscape features in advertising, and I just love these pictures because, again, I think they show us ourselves. And here's one I pulled out of the newspaper today. You get USA Today if you stay at the Garden Inn. And this is one big field for landscape photography. It's car ads. And the rule is you must never show more than one car. Right? I did the drive from Los Angeles Airport yesterday. 14 lanes. But no, don't show that ever, ever. Show us one car, hopefully on hairpin roads in Scotland. Right? And I'm always, I'm a subscriber, like I'm sure a lot of you are, to the New Yorker. I think people are pretty bright that read the New Yorker. And yet, when we turn the page and we have the ad for Audi or Lexus, we fall for it every time. Oh, look at that car all by itself. We should buy that. It's only $75,000. Buy that now, because we need that. So landscape is everywhere. In fact, I counted 4 photographs today that counted as landscape. I'm not going to show you them all, but here's another one. What is this one for now? Medicare supplement plans. So no old age homes there. Just like out in nature with backpacks. So, landscape is just everywhere when you start looking for them. And so because of that, I thought, well, I'm not going to put those pictures in my book, with the exception of the Swiss Caran d'Ache. I'm not going to put those pictures in my book because they have a purchase on our heads anyway. They're everywhere. Those budgets are phenomenal. And they're also reproduced. When AT&T does an ad campaign, their print budget for 4 days is $175 million. That's what they buy in print for 4 days. Oh, no, it's not media. And we see those images everywhere. And what we don't see very much is the artist's work. Even the famous artist's work, if you think about it. We have gallery and museum exhibitions. We have books like mine that may sell 10,000 copies in the English-speaking world, as considered good in the photography world. So we're reaching very small numbers of people, and I thought, well, I'm going to stay faithful to the group that I think is doing the most interesting work about the landscape. And a word about how I accumulate pictures and how I define them. When I start a project like Landmark, I start gathering pictures everywhere. I ask friends of mine who they think is interesting. I go on the internet. I buy books. I look at magazines. I just accumulate them. And I do not order them. I just look at them and say, oh, that's great, put that in the file. That's great, put it in the file. I call photographers, I internet them, I Google them, I do all those things. And I get thousands of photographs. And then I realize, oops, I only have room for maybe 250. Something has to go. And of course you see things that are too similar to each other, and you see things that are stronger than, suddenly you think that's the best picture of a mountain you've ever seen, and then oops, you see somebody who's done something better, so you lose interest in the other thing. And it's like cooking a little bit. You know, you add a little salt, it's too salty, add a little sugar, whatever. I don't cook, but I assume that's the way it's done. Until you get it to taste delicious. So that's the way I do it, and only when I have a lot of pictures do I spread them out. I like to do it in an auditorium, ideally, a big empty space, or a gallery, a museum gallery. Spread them all out on the floor and then look at them from a height. I'm tall, so it helps. And try to see what patterns are emerging. And I spend a lot of time doing that. And with this book, there are 10 chapters. Could have been 15, could have been 12. They're very subjective. I will not say that they're arbitrary. I won't say that. They're not arbitrary. I really think about what I'm doing. But they're subjective in the sense that any of you might say, well, I'm not sure why you put that picture in that section. I think it would have fitted better in that. I would say to you, oh, okay, yeah, that's true. It could work there too. It's not as if they only have one meaning. So I'm going to read to you the introduction of one of these chapters. And it's called The Sublime, because the Sublime is the beginning of the book. It's the first one. And I knew that I wanted to do a book that did two things. It showed the trajectory of the sublime to the ridiculous. We all know that phrase in English. And Napoleon's famous phrase is a small step from the sublime to the ridiculous. And I wanted also to do fact to fiction. And that was inspired by my Kindle. And I got a Kindle for Christmas last year, and on it was What Maisie Knew by Henry James. And I thought, ooh, I've never read that. It was free. So I found this beautiful phrase about fiction. And it goes like this. She took refuge on the firm ground of fiction, through which there curled the blue river of truth. I thought, that's it. That's it. I want pictures that are fantasy, that are photoshopped, that are imagination, pure imagination, and so on. So those are the two big threads of this book, sublime to the ridiculous and fact to fiction. And now I'm going to ask Hannah, unless she's gone to sleep. Hannah, are you going to do the clinking from here, or I'm going to do that? I've forgotten. Okay. The word sublime appears regularly in text by critics and photographers, although its meaning has shifted considerably since Edmund Burke's seminal Inquiry in the 18th century. Burke believed a feeling of terror was central to the concept. Before nature's greatest forces, all mankind's artifices were insignificant. By the early 20th century, the concept had softened and broadened. Rainer Maria Rilke could write, quote, "These trees are magnificent, but even more magnificent is the sublime and moving space between them, as though with their growth it too increased." Today, anything with an earthy sublimity that inspires a Burkean terror is hard to imagine. Hurricanes, earthquakes, tsunamis, certainly strike fear into people in their path, still they hardly make for aesthetic contemplation. As the writer Alan Baton notes, we are now deep in the era of the technological sublime, when awe could most powerfully be invoked not by forests or icebergs, but by supercomputers, rockets, and particle accelerators. We are now, he concludes, almost exclusively amazed by ourselves. We also read of the industrial sublime, the apocalyptic sublime, even the hysterical sublime, global, cybernetic, totalizing. We might also imagine a kitsch sublime is when a promoter enthuses about Florida's blizzard beach, where one can, quote, beat the heat, ride the chairlift to the summit of Mount Gashmore, and slide down the summit plummet. As for any feelings of sheer terror when faced with the landscape, say those famous Arctic wastes that explorers at an earlier age suffered, that kind of sublimity is more likely to be felt at 35,000 feet when the pilot comes on with an announcement that 3 of the engines have failed. Most often today, terror is reserved for the shadow and darkness of the widescreen cinema. Are there any vestiges left, then, of the original notion, if not terror, at least awe? One realm where it does make sense to talk of the sublime in the Burkean sense is deep space. It's hard to be blasé about the vast reaches of the universe when our telescopes reveal that 60 billion stars may harbor Earth-like planets. Thankfully, photographers such as David Mallon and Chris McCaw have their sharp eyes turned to the heavens, joined by NASA's seemingly endless probes. The next two, please. The one before is one of the moons of Saturn, one of the rings. And this is the next picture is the North Pole, our moon's North Pole. As for our own lovely planet, there are indeed photographers who still acknowledge the lure of the earthly sublime. Sally Mann, for one, is mesmerized by a southern forest's thick vesperine gloaming. While Mark Klett and Byron Wolfe, faced with the always majestic Grand Canyon, extend and expand upon Ansel Adams' vision. This is Ansel Adams here. They extend upon it, reminding us of the substantial effects of weather and the arbitrariness of a single point of view. Richard Mizrak deftly transforms landforms into eerie, barren, otherworldly places, a vision perhaps of a post-human Earth. The sea also remains something of earlier ideas of sublimity. Hiroshi Sugimoto finds it again and again where sea meets sky on equal terms. Susan Durges captures a single wave as it hurls itself against the shore in all its elemental fury. Carlo Valsecchi frames, or rather reframes, the shimmering Aegean as if it were a delicate Chinese watercolor, just as the owner of the famous Casa Malaparte on Capri intended his picture window to be appreciated. So I just say, this is the floor of the house, this is the wall, and this is a wooden frame he's put around the window. So it's not the photographer doing this is the architect. This is the famous house in the Brigitte Bardot film Contempt, if any of you know your cinema. And then there is ice majestic and fearsome, as Burke would have loved, as depicted by Olaf Otto Becker and Dan Holdsworth. Sorry, that's the first one with Dan Holdsworth. This is Otto Olaf Becker. Becker actually took a kayak and paddled 2,000 miles north and 2,000 kilometers north and 2,000 kilometers south to take his photographs. He found mosquitoes in the Arctic during the summer, by the way. So can we go back one? I'm sorry, I got the two mixed up. So that's Dan Holdsworth. His godlike camera floats disembodied above a more hellish landscape with no possibility of human purchase. Both Becker and Holdsworth remind us that in its original sense, the sublime evoked transcendence, a journey from civilization to frozen climes, offered the traveler the possibility of an encounter with the divine and union with the world of nature. So I then went on to a chapter I called Pastoral. And I'm only going to show you one picture from this chapter, Pastoral, but basically, sublime meant without the presence of man. And the second chapter, Pastoral, now you feel a relationship of man and nature in balance with each other. In the book, it gets increasingly dark, so each chapter takes you further into the imbalance until you come to the ridiculous. But at this moment, I wanted to show you this picture because I did a little exercise when I read the caption to this photograph, which is Cookmere Haven, Sussex. And I thought, oh, that's where my family comes from, Sussex. I don't know this place. We now have this wonderful technique called Google Maps, and Jim is going to help me show you something about this. So I'd like you, just before we go on there, Jim, just look at this picture. It's very romantic. It feels a little bit like a Caspar David Friedrich. The river curls gently toward the sea. He's taken a vantage point which shows us just a sliver of sea. So we're situated, and it has a wonderful glow to it, a romantic glow to it. And it's the kind of place that most of us would think, I'd like to be there. I'd like to be walking there. I'd like to see this. It's unspoiled England, the way the tourist people would like it to be thought of. And here's a serious photographer who works and walks all over England looking for pictures of great beauty. So I thought, okay, I'm going to go on to Google.
Like this out.
Yes, absolutely. And I told you we can take his time doing this because it took me time. If you're doing it on your computers, it'll take you time. So we first went to the map, and I thought, ha, this must be it. This must be it. I noticed one curious thing. I noticed that this river, it says Cookmere River, and this says Cookmere River. And I realized that they've just left this for decorative purposes. This is the real business river now, Cookmere River. They've straightened it out. But they've left this bit of history. So what you saw in Corey Wright's picture was a kind of anachronism. It's still real, but it's not the whole reality. He's not showing us that. So then I thought, oh, we can go down and take a look at it now with this little guy. So can we go to satellite view? So there's the satellite view. If you know the English coast, Brighton is just up here. So you see how close we are to civilization. Like 5 minutes and you're in the city. And then I thought, let's go down, let's take our little guy and put him right here. And voila, there we are. So Harry must have been somewhere here or on a hill just behind here, because that's the view. And then if we move around, we see a parking lot, a fish and chips van, a hotel, lots of cars. Now you can understand why those Britons never stop and look. Right? It's still nice, it's still countryside, but it's nothing like the sea is over here. There's the sea, okay? But it doesn't want to make you want to be there. Can we go back to Harry Corey Wright's photograph? So I just wanted to take one photograph and show you that, because the one thing we as a public and even curators don't think of very much is what it took to get that photograph. And these people spend hours and hours looking, trekking, hiking with big 8x10 cameras, Most of them, they're sort of slipping into digital as digital gets better and better. Most of them are still shooting with film because it still has a quality they like. They have to feel the right weather, and they have to find the right vantage point. And he may be taking 3 or 4 photographs at most. And then he has to go away and develop them, and maybe even go back if he's not happy with his picture. So there's the technical aspect, but also how he organizes the picture. If you noticed on the Google, everything's sort of flat. You don't have this serpentine sense of the river. But here, you have it beautifully. And you have these the cattle sort of adding little studs that sort of add life to the picture. All right, so that was a chapter called Pastoral. I'm not showing you any other pictures from that chapter. And then I thought, the next thing you have in the environment is man's heavy hand artifacts. And a lot of these artifacts are very beautiful. This is the bridge at Hoover Dam. And it almost looks like a time-lapse photograph, doesn't it? The building, all of these structures here, these are temporary structures just to build the arch. They're all going to be taken away. So you have this phenomenal bit of human ingenuity, phenomenal thing. We're also blasé about all that stuff. Oh, yeah, there's a new dam there. I don't approve of dams. All of this high technology that we're so good at, these things that we do as a species, these astonishing things, photographers also show us in a way that I think makes us realize that these are things to be celebrated. Perhaps with all the problems it create for us, but at least to be admitted to. Photographers give us things that we don't see ourselves. They travel to places that we don't have access to ourselves. But they don't have to be grand things. Rob Hahn likes what he calls the spaces in between things. He's not interested in the big subjects. He likes the crazy little things that people won't even bother thinking about. Olivo Barbieri, who wants to create a mystical sense. This is the Oscar Niemeyer Museum in Rio de Janeiro. But he creates it in an almost unreal sense. It reminds me of a sort of spacecraft where people are going in and they don't come out. This alien thing. It's like a tongue. He does this with a manipulation of color. It's a very real picture, but it's a manipulation of color to achieve those extraordinary effects. Or Peter Bielobrovsky, a young German photographer, who finds these strange artifacts, and you don't know what that thing is, what purpose it could possibly be, other than a place you could go up to the top and come down again. Giles Price, who photographed the Olympic Stadium as it was being constructed. And I love the kind of accidents, the visual accidents. They're building the map of London. So it's a funny kind of thing, because this is the kind of thing we're used to seeing on Google Maps, right? Or Google Earth, go in and zoom out. But it's a real thing they're constructing to look like that. And then you have all these little jagged edges that look like pixels, but it's just the construction of the stadium. And I showed it to my son, who's 16, and said, it looks like the interior of the CERN particle collider in Geneva. I said, well, yeah, it is, in a way. It is. It's a social equivalent. The columnist David Brooks, the conservative columnist in the New York Times, wrote last week, and he said, why is it that Americans are always denying what they do best, which is big things? And I think it's true of Western civilization generally. What we do really well is big things. Big wars, big science, big entertainment. And I think photography is a way of kind of admitting that to ourselves and showing the beauty of it at the same time, and the order and the complexity of it. You can still be critical about it. New Road Systems in China by Nanav Kandar. Monuments, great monuments. But he also shows us, he doesn't show us a finished thing, he shows us the stages of construction, where we're all like human insects. You know, we're insects constructing these extraordinary things. Or Thomas Struth, this is an oil platform, gigantic oil platform, being ready to be towed out to sea. Or Philippe Chancel, Abu Dhabi. You know, this is that tallest building in the world, I think it is. And look at these skyscrapers here, not even worth considering. A mere 50 stories. And yet, he's made it look as though it's human anthill. It's a very critical picture. The perspective makes it in such a way that it's not impressive. It's not record-breaking impressive. It's not from the ground up. It's not the kind of picture a tourist will try to capture. It makes it look puny. It makes it look pathetic. Or Michael Light, who photographs the greatest open pit mine in the world. And he does it from the air, and you only slowly begin to realize the scale at which you're dealing. These are trains. The scale at which you are, the scale of this enterprise. Or Mitch Epstein. I saw this on the drive from Los Angeles to San Diego last year. I guess I was sensitive to seeing it because I'd seen the photograph. But he's photographed it in a very amusing way. The greenery, it's a classic trick of early 20th century photography to humanize something by putting greenery in the corners. Sometimes photographers hold branches into the corners. I don't think Mitch did that, but it's interesting that he still has made this terrifying object, which is sort of almost militaristic and aggressive and, you know, macho. It's kind of, you know, feminized it slightly, you know, with nature. But nature looks quite silly at the same time, doesn't it? Who bothered? Why bother? You know, what's this meant to? Is this meant to hide it? Jürgen Devsker, who photographs the landscapes of Europe, the new landscapes of Europe. Our landscapes are being filled with wind turbines, wherever you look. I happen to like them, but most people hate them. And Brad Moore from Los Angeles, I found this picture. I just loved it. I thought those cranes look alive. They look as though they're sort of desperate to get out of their little compound. And he, like the Rob Pond who did the Leaning Tower, he also looks for odd little things, and fences and shrubs behind them. Our human need to control nature. Jeffrey James, who shows an Auditorium cutting a park in half in upstate New York. And you have this sense almost of the cathedral here. So kind of homage. John Davies, who photographs transformation, landscapes and urban landscapes in Great Britain. This is, I was going to say Manchester, but I'm not sure, Sheffield and Manchester, one of those great cities, full of information about the past. You know, the old canal, transportation systems, the new Hyatt Hotel, dwarfing everything else, looking at like a kind of otherworldly slab. A lot of photographers do not make photographs that are overtly critical. They present the world as it is, and they say it's up to you to decide how you feel about it. Some photographers are overtly critical. They show us things they don't like, and they want change. Look at this pollution. You know, look at this deforestation. We don't like this. But other photographers say, no, I'm a photographer. Robert Polidori, that's the famous Frank Gehry building in Bilbao. And I love the picture because you never see it like that, right? The tourist people would never allow that picture to go out. And it just looks like a total mess. and all that crap here, you know. But in a way, you know, when I saw this picture, I said, yeah, that's the way I would see it. You know, I'm sure if I went to Bilbao, I wouldn't be staying in the 6-star hotel or whatever. I'd be in a little dive somewhere. That's what I would see. And I think it's really important to have the photographers just reminding us that the world is a messier place than we think it is. Most of it has been seduced by the official photographs. And then, as I said, things start to get a little nastier in Rupture. After the great hurricane in Louisiana, Mitch Epstein, and yet beautiful, in a sense, aesthetically beautiful. This is not to say that it's beautiful in terms of what it means, but a lot of photographers will argue that beauty or aesthetics is an important way of getting us to look at the horror of life. A lot of photographs in the press, you see, you kind of, I don't know what's happening in Syria today or Iraq and so on. You just turn the page, right? Because it's too painful. Whereas, and that's what photojournalism should be. But art photography tries to deal with these very, very difficult things, but also kind of seducing us, making us want to look. We feel guilty talking about beauty in subjects like this. Karen Apollonia Muller, this is a California picture. And in fact, you think it's quite a normal picture until you see all the houses sliding up, falling off into the canyons. And I understand that kind of thing happens quite a bit here. Is that? You're sort of used to that, right? No. I shouldn't be joking about a subject that close to home, perhaps. But it's also interesting, a photojournalist would not take a photograph like that. A photojournalist would be right up in there. And you'd be seeing people, you know, wailing and upset and hugging each other and so on. And she is very cool. She pulls back and she says, this is, you know, 21st century. This is what we do and the risks we take and the places we build. And this is life as it's lived. The same thing here. This was just somebody who built their house in Norway too close to the water. He wanted his view a little too much. And while he was in it, it tipped over. And he had to be rescued from this window. And yet, again, a picture of great beauty. If you think just a bit for a moment of the complementary colors, all that grayness, and then the complementary orange. And Michael Light again, houses on the edge. And Pablo Lopez Lutz, a view of Mexico City. Waves and waves of humanity. It really looks like it's something which is moving. And of course it is moving. If you think of any city. I had a show of Los Angeles photography 2 years ago in the Musée de l'Élysée. Big show that the Huntington had put together. And I was able to the museum was built in 1781. And wasn't a museum then, but the building was built in 1781. And California, Los Angeles was founded in 1781 with 12 families, if I'm not mistaken. So I was able to say at the opening, and I said, this museum is founded at the same moment as Los Angeles was, and you guys grew to 60 million people, and we, you know, grew to 16 people. And this is a kind of metaphor, I think, for city life and metropolis, certainly in the third world. It would seem there's kind of no escape from it. And those cities, those vast cities, are becoming vaster and more problematic. And then I took the Swiss. The Swiss are losing their glaciers. They're melting much faster. They think now by 2050 the glaciers will all be gone. Republicans don't agree, but the Swiss feel it. And so, but Switzerland's a rich country, so we wrap them up in duvets, you see? You wrap them up so they don't melt. And the photographer takes this wonderful position. He could have waited for when nobody was there, but it wouldn't have been funny. It would have just been a documentary photograph. But no, he waits for our little insect species to arrive, because we are also the ones responsible for this. Maybe not these people particular, maybe not us in particular, but collectively, we're responsible for all this. And here we are observing it as tourists. Chernobyl. And yet, it reminds me every time I look at it, I think I'm looking at a constable. And I can't tell you how many people, when they see this picture for the first time, they say, "Are the cows sleeping?" I think, well, yeah, forever. And yet it's beautiful. You can't help but being seduced by the picture. And then you can deal with the terror. Or David Meisel's view of Owens Lake. And he said to me at the opening, we had this picture at the show at Somerset House, he said, "You'll feel so terrible about this picture because these are all of these polluting chemicals that are gathered in these beds in Owens Lake. They're what make color photography possible." So this beautiful picture you're looking at is possible because of those chemicals that are polluting our systems. And then Michael Light again, the most sublime kind of light we can made by humans today. And then Joel Sternfeld, who took many photographs of the High Line, the new park in New York City. But I like this one because this was before it had been made into the park. And it just feels like a wonderful meadow. It could be anywhere if it weren't for the context. And in a funny kind of way, all New York looks like a ruin. It all looks like an old city, a city that has passed its prime. It's not really the case, but I think probably at the moment you took the picture, well before the park ever came into existence, New York did have a bit of that feeling. And then I found a number of photographs that sort of had mysteries to them. Like, why did this highway decide to stop suddenly? Oops, didn't see the sea coming there, better go back quickly. And why are there no cars on it? And whose bright idea was this? But photography just gives it to you. See, here it is, and you figure it out. Or this. This is in Saudi Arabia. But here's an example of how a photographer can kind of trick us. Of course, this is an exit on the highway, and we're standing in this lane. If he had put his camera here, the arrows wouldn't have been funny. Because you would say, well, of course, this is the exit. And this sand dune is coming, but it's this idea of the arrow pointing to nowhere and no context, which makes the joke. Photographers are very good at kind of slicing off bits of reality to create that mystery. Richard Misrak, I like this picture. It looks a little like Jackson Pollock, doesn't it? Because there's no way out, there's no way through. For me, it's a metaphor of the situation we are in with nature. We just don't know what to do. Whatever we do, we're screwing it up. I read in the Times last week that the worst thing you can do is plant lots of trees, it said. Because that seems to make all kinds of new gases. And if it's planted in the wrong place, it's the wrong gases. So I threw my hands up in the air with despair, okay, I thought that was the answer, more trees, no. And I think this kind of picture is a way of saying we don't know how to get out of the mess we've made. Those are my words, not Richard Misrak's. Trevor Paglen, who photographs secret American sites that don't exist. He's very funny about it. If you can look at one of his TED Talks, he says, well, You know, you might have a secret American base somewhere, but it's staffed with people. And that means disgruntled workers who've been fired, or people who are having a fight with their boss, and who like to talk, who are angry. They have to park their cars somewhere. There's a parking lot. You go to the parking lot and say, excuse me, what's that base over there? Oh, I'm not supposed to talk about it, but you know, you get all kinds of information once you start looking, and he finds he's a geographer. But he's really interested in how power actually works. He's not a conspiracy theorist. He wants to know how power actually works. That's another one of the secret sites. Or Mishka Henner, who mines the internet for bizarre places. Like these are sites that Google has had to disguise because they're secret military, or not secret necessarily, but what's the word I want? Covert. Well, they just don't want enemies to be able to see what is actually there. Camouflage. So, but he likes them because they create a new kind of artwork. And he's got lots of them. They're very, very funny. And this is a Hungarian photographer who finds the most extraordinary patterns also on the internet, on Google. And this one's over in New Mexico. And they all end up looking like these wonderful kind of abstract paintings. And Dan Holdsworth again, this is Mount St. Helens. This is a photograph, and it's not a photograph. Do you see Mount St. Helens here? So why is there no vegetation? Well, it's an absolutely accurate image, stripped of all the vegetation. How do we do that? Because it's made up of radar coordinates. So it's all radar imagery, which he's pieced together. He's taken all the information, numbers, digital, and he's asked the computer basically to turn it into an image. So it's a perfect map, but stripped of vegetation. So what is it? You can't really call it a photograph. And then Robert Voigt, who loves finding these communications towers which are disguised as trees. And they're all over the world. People refuse to have these towers in their backyard, so to speak, so they're disguised as these things. And he's got a whole book and a show, and he's making a whole career out of finding them. And David Mizell again, this is Owens Lake again, pollution. But I like the picture purely metaphorically because it reminds me of a wound, a kind of gaping wound, a festering wound. And I think as a metaphor again, it's a very powerful one for the world that we are creating. And it's also very beautiful. As an image, it's very beautiful. Edgar Martins, who photographs strange places like this airport that has no lights on it. He just likes what he can do there with his own lights. And Robert Davies, who photographs jet trails, contrails, and then identifies all the planes by computer. So we know this is a flight to Johannesburg, and this is all from Heathrow, and this is going to Moscow, and this is going to... But for me, it's filaments. It's the filaments of some sea creature. And that's why I called all those pictures, I gathered them under the term enigma. Because I think you don't really need to know anything. You might say, if you were collectors here, you might say, I like that picture, I want that picture, before you ask, what is it? And then I ended the book with 2 chapters on dream. I'm just going to show you one quickly. And I found this wonderful quote from 1888. Composite portraits are absolute quackery. What's next? Composite landscapes? And of course, that's exactly what people like Jeff Wall or Thomas de Man do, composite landscapes. So this guy would be turning over in his grave. These are mountains, the Chilean Andes, but reconfigured to follow the gyrations of the stock market in 2008. And the photographer really climbed the mountains to take the pictures, but then the computer reconfigured them. The same thing here. This photographer makes monuments that don't really exist in the cliffs of Dover. And these are also specific, this is, I think, oil shares after some shock or something, mobile oil shares, and this is some other peak. He's made a whole series of monuments to the financial crisis. But this is so wonderful. This, for me, is a wonderful thing to talk to young students who are learning photography, whatever. You don't think about those signs if the poles are there. If we looked at that picture with the poles, you wouldn't even see the signs, really. You'd be looking down below. Taking out the signs turns the whole thing into an absurd kind of game. We're suddenly aware of that language. I was a bit naughty in the book. I had Jesus, and then I had and Lauren Marsollier. Is she here by any chance? Lauren, here she is. Fantastic. Came up from LA. And this composite is made up of, I think you told me 30 pictures, something, or
no, this one is a dozen.
A dozen, that's right. A dozen pictures, and she sent me the individuals. I was really shocked to find that this was quite small. This was quite small. It's all, she has played with the sizes and so on to make a new kind of reality, which is surreal and haunting and sort of directionless. I mean, you don't know, there's no there. Amy Stein, a kind of, it's not a real animal, it's a composite, but it's a kind of bewildered savage animal in the urban environment. And yet, what an urban environment, and a kind of light from heaven, but it's our light, of course. Ori Gersh, who photographed this lovely bucolic scene in a traffic circle in downtown London, centre of London, Elderly Castle. And Complaining Forest. This is not a photographer, Olaf Brüning. He's actually more of a sculptor. And so he goes into environments and he uses twigs and things from the environment to construct these statements. It's called Complaining Forest. And I thought it was a wonderful metaphor. Peter Knapp, who's actually someone purely associated with the fashion business in Paris, an art director at Elle magazine, and just kind of by accident, I know Peter, and I saw this picture he'd made. It's a negative picture of the Exxon oil spill, negative picture, and he was on the beach, and he picked up all these bits of plastic and so on, and he made this, what the French call fleur de mal, this evil thing of detritus, as a kind of, I won't say celebrate this awful moment, to consecrate this awful moment of human folly. Yao Lu, a Chinese photographer who finds that all over China you have these garbage bags. And so he makes traditional Chinese pictures with these garbage bags. That's all garbage when you look closely. Richard Moss, who uses infrared film to photograph killing fields in Africa. They don't look like that, of course. They don't look like killing fields, but that's what they are. John Gerard, who takes old photographs from the 1930s and reanimates them. This is actually a moving image. Dust storm in the 1930s. And Darren Allman, who photographs mining sites in Siberia. But the nickel mining has killed everything living for miles and miles and miles around. Almost impossible to get into these places because, of course, the mining companies don't want you to know about it. So I don't know, I've probably been talking for about 3 hours now. But before we end, do I have another 10 minutes? Would that be too much?
Go for it.
I would just like to read you one or two excerpts from what I call artists' voices. I asked each photographer to say something about their work, and I promised not to edit them. And although we copy edit them, corrected the spelling and so on. But we didn't change any substance. I really wanted the artists to have their own voice. I'm just going to read you a few excerpts. Darren Allman pictures. I started by visiting the sites of former gulags, which remain to this day nickel mines and smelting plants that are extremely large players within the global economy. Norilsk, the company he's photographing, alone can control the price of world nickel. Benoit Aquin writes, I'm particularly drawn to subjects that touch upon social and economic systems, issues that represent the world's real challenges. In my work, my attention is to take a fresh, honest look at the relationship between humanity and its environment. Olivo Barbieri, who took the photograph of the Oscar Niemeyer Museum, writes, I started the project in 2003 using photographs and film to portray more than 40 cities. I wanted to represent the world as a temporary installation and a possibility that only art gives, to consider it as unreal and unfinished in order to be able to interpret it, judge it, and change it. Olaf Brunning, who did The Complaining Forest, writes, I complain a lot. While I was standing in front of a forest near Copenhagen, I was thinking, well, why does nature never complain? We always project beauty and big ideas, our own ideas and wishes onto nature. But nature doesn't care about our thinking. I really wish forests would complain more often. Lynn Cohen, who photographs only interiors, but sometimes they have decorative elements of environments, she writes, the landscape creeps into my work surreptitiously and often. My photographs, both color and black and white, invariably show unpeopled interiors, with the suggestion that someone has just left or is about to arrive. But nature tends to infiltrate and tries to escape. And see, we have Lauren here. I'm going to read hers. Are you embarrassed by this? The work probes the phenomenon of transition, both as a psychological process and a manifestation of the built environment. Our fast mutating and increasingly hyper-real world causes a shift in our awareness. This experience unleashes a flow of new and elusive perceptions, which I explore by giving them the visual characteristics of a landscape. My photomontages are composed of photographs I have taken in various separate locations. I like to be able to create my own pictures without having to depend entirely on what ready-made setting I can find outside. Instead, my process enables me to create them in a similar way to how we form a mental image, constructing it with selected fragments from our experiences. And I think I will end there because I could go on. But delighted to chat more in the lobby and sign some books.